Hi, my name is Nancy Viehmann, and today I'm reading two stories from the book Old Maine Women. And it was written by Glenna Johnson Smith, who grew up in the 20s and 30s and wrote about her experiences, but also experiences of stories that she knew about. So the first one is String Too Short to Save. Today I watched a man throw my week's accumulation of garbage into the maw of a giant truck. I don't consider myself wasteful, but as the noisy machine chewed my trash, I could imagine my mother's scowl of disapproval. I can't recall from my childhood in the 20s that we had any garbage to speak of. In many ways, my mother was like all the other women, but she did have a reputation for being more frugal than most, because she had been brought up by a grandmother who was considered a miserly recluse. Like Grammy Knight, Mama never did join in the American excitement of throwing away the old and buying new from the 5 and dime store. As a conforming teenager, I was sometimes embarrassed that Mama didn't buy 98-cent flowered percale house dresses like other women wore. Summer people gave her boxes of clothes. She ran the post office, but she kept her sewing machine in a window where she could see approaching customers, and at odd moments, she would darn, patch, and make items over for herself, me, relatives, and neighbor kids. Though I often thought she looked bizarre, she enjoyed her secondhand finery. For many winters, she wore a maroon wool dress that went through a variety of collars and cuffs. My favorite was a lovely beige lace set cut from the discarded underpants of a summer lady. Once Mama made me a dark green wool skirt. What will I say, I complained, if people ask me if this was something of my grandmother's that you made over? She gave me her sweet, smug smile. This cloth comes from a suit your great-grandmother LaSalle had made back in the 1890s. I must admit I liked that skirt and wore it through high school and college. When I outgrew it, Mama took it back, and I suspect that somewhere in a wool quilt or braided rug, pieces of that green serge still live. Mama patched and darned sheets and tablecloths, and when they finally had to be discarded, she cut them into pieces, ironed them, and packed them neatly for emergencies. Once a young family was burned out, and Mama's old, soft, white pieces served for diapers, crib sheets, and handkerchiefs. Often they were used for bandages. When a much-patched dress was too worn to wear, Mama saved the buttons, snaps, buckles, and hooks and eyes. Then for future quilts, she cut up any pieces that still held together. In later years, she could never understand why people brought new cloth for quilt making. The whole point of quilting was to get something beautiful and warm from discards. Remember this old joke? What's in this box, Emma? String too short to save. That could have been written about Mama. She saved every greeting card that came to our house, cut out the pictures, stuck them into scrapbooks, and sent them once a year to be given to people in a hospital's contagious disease ward. Since she was using something a second time, it didn't bother her that a scrapbook had to be burned when the patient could no longer look at it. Mama loved making doll clothes from scraps and never forgave me for having all sons. What fun she would have had with her great-granddaughters, my dear granddaughters. Mama was a talented cook, but saved food just as much as she saved everything else. Although we had neither icebox nor refrigerator, only the rich had them, none of our food ever spoiled. She went every day to the butcher, or else the fish man came by, and she bought just enough for the day. What was left from noon appeared at supper in a salad, stew, or casserole. If there happened to be an extra serving, Mama would take it across the hill to old Aunt Toon. Although there were no surplus food programs, I suspect it was a rare day when Aunt Toon, who lived alone, didn't receive a bowl of stew, some Johnny cake, and a piece of pie from someone. But back to the garbage. I tell myself that something must have been thrown out back then. Not shoes. Papa learned to put on new soles and heels. Not old pots and pans with holes in them. They could be patched. Not old magazines. They were given to shut-ins. Waste paper was needed to build the 3 wood fires. The kitchen stove was lit every day for cooking and heating the water tank. But my parents didn't believe in heating a room with nobody in it, so the post office stove wasn't lit on Sundays, and the living room stove was lit only on Sundays and an occasional evening. We slept in cold bedrooms, but that was no punishment. My bed had a feather tick and blanket sheets, and on cold nights, smooth, hot rocks from the oven wrapped in old pieces of blanket. The rocks cooled off in the night, but by that time I was so cozy and warm it didn't matter. I still like to sleep in a cold room. Because Mama raised and canned her own vegetables and picked and preserved her own fruit and berries, we had few tin cans to discard. Lard and peanut butter came in little pails, which were used forever after for berry picking. She took a cloth bag to the grocery store, much like today's shoppers are urged to do, and her own dish to the butcher and the fish man, so there were no disposable wrappings. The few table scraps, peelings and all, went to a neighbor's pig or were thrown into a little pit behind the house. What the small animals and birds didn't eat became compost. Out of that pile grew the biggest blackberries in town. One of Mama's recyclings bothered a few squeamish neighbors. We had no indoor plumbing, and our outhouse was behind the little barn where Papa kept the Model T. Behind the outhouse was the reddest, healthiest stand of rhubarb anywhere around. Why waste a good source of fertilizer, Mama would ask. Some hardy souls came to pick it, and even the ones who didn't would not refuse a second piece of Mama's creamy rhubarb pie topped with high peaks of meringue. Although we had few of the world's goods in the 1920s, I can't say I felt deprived. Once when I was very young, I asked Papa if we were rich or poor. He thought before answering, "Poor, I guess." I would have believed rich. I had good food to eat, clean clothes, a safe and quiet world for dreaming and playing, and a comfortable bed for sleep. What else could rich provide? As she grew older, Mama was aghast at American throwaway consumption. "It has to stop," she'd say. "There isn't enough for everyone forever." But many of us in my generation, in our modern wisdom, looked around at the woods and the empty spaces. We pointed with pride at our technology and our spewing smokestacks and said, "Of course there'll always be enough." If Kathleen Proctor Johnson were around today, she'd be proud of her grandsons and their wives, who use their resources carefully and respect the environment. Yet, if she could see what a garbage dump many of us are making of our world, I think we'd see her pursed lips and scowly smile, and she'd say, "Why didn't you listen?" The next story is the Sears and Roebuck wife. Actually, Orrin Coombs got his wife from an advertisement in a magazine. Even though you could buy a buggy and a harness for the horse, even though you could send for tombstones, even though you could order tires for the Model T, the Sears and Roebuck catalog didn't offer wives. Yet the neighbors continued to refer to her as the wife Orrin got from Sears and Roebuck. The truth is, for Orrin Coombs to get a wife by any means was beyond belief. He'd been a bachelor forever. He didn't even talk to people. Some said he was deaf, but others said he just didn't want to be bothered. By hiding in the post office and listening to adult conversations, I learned that he'd been in love with a girl once, but that she met up with a traveling man from Bangor, and off she went. There were rumors that she died young and in terrible circumstances. Anyway, Orrin never looked at another woman. He just grew thinner and more stooped and got a thicker crust of smoke and grime from his blacksmith shop. When I was a kid, I thought he was very old, but reckoning back, I guess he was in his early 40s during the village-shattering year of the mail-order bride. Orrin had found the name and address of a woman from the South, and their letters went back and forth unknown to everyone but my mother, the postmistress. She was so tight-lipped about post office business that she didn't even mention the situation to my father. Since the blacksmith shop was next door, Orrin could come over to mail a letter or collect one when nobody else was around. I wouldn't be surprised if he and my mother had signals. But strange things began to happen and the neighbors became suspicious. Why would old Orrin, who lived with his mother, suddenly build a kitchen, a real bathroom? And why would he buy a lot up to the pond and build a little cabin with a screened-in porch on it? And buy 2 white wicker rocking chairs for the porch? Then one day he drove home in a new sporty blue Chevrolet coupe. Why, when he had that old Model T truck, black and grimy like him? People watched him and they spied on a few single women in the area, but they couldn't discover a thing. Then, to cap it off, Orrin appeared one morning all cleaned up and in a blue serge suit, white tie, and shirt. Nobody had ever seen him dressed up. Even though his mother had been superintendent of the Sunday school for 40 years, Orrin never went to church, so he had no reason to wear anything but the smoky overalls. The only thing Orrin ever did besides work was pitch horseshoes. Close to the blacksmith shop, he had the finest pit in town. White sand from the shore, shiny stakes, and perfectly balanced shoes that he had forged. He practiced by the hour between jobs. He played with such concentration, skill, and controlled violence that he had few opponents. Alpheus Hall, who threw the shoes with less force than Orrin, could win a game once in a while. The Williamson boys, who lived on the other side of the blacksmith shop, played as soon as they were big enough. They'd practice while Orrin worked at the forge, and he'd take them on now and then. Sometimes I'd watch from my bedroom window and see a game start right after supper and go on to the dark of a long summer evening. Sometimes I'd go to sleep before a game was finished and wake with a start when there'd be a great clank as a shoe slammed into a stake. Once he began building the addition to the house, Orrin practiced less and less. I remember the night that Billy Williamson beat him. Billy was so shocked he couldn't say a word, but Orrin didn't seem to care. The day he appeared slicked up and in the suit, he started the Chevy, shiny as a copper kettle, and drove off up the road. Old Ada Morris, who had second sight, watched him from the post office steps and said, "We'll never see Orrin again, alive." But he was only gone about long enough to drive to Tunk's station, flag down the noon train, and load on his passenger with her luggage. And there she was. They must have found a justice of the peace on the way home, for he introduced tiny, straight, trim Jessica Shelley as his wife. The men decided she didn't have a pretty face, but she wasn't as bad as Beak Alley said when he heard she was from South Carolina. Couldn't have been anyone between here's there that would have her. Beak's wife, Goldie, answered, "There sure wasn't anyone in that distance that would have him." The neighbors didn't know what to make of the dignified little woman with the southern accent and the strange habits. There were afternoon naps, for instance. The men and women I knew believed that only young children, the aged, the infirm, the seriously ill, and the bone-lazy slept in the daytime. Real people got up at dawn, earlier in the winter, and kept at it until bedtime. The truth is, however, that some women took naps they didn't dare admit to. Amy Bartlett knew well enough that her sister Hope Williamson slept in the daytime, and because Amy was a big tease, she tried to catch Hope napping. She'd walk in the door and call, "Yoo-hoo! You home, Hope?" And Hope would come running downstairs looking half asleep. "Course I'm home. Where would I be in the middle of the day but here doing my housework?" Did I wake you up? Wake me up? Good gracious, no. I was straightening up a few bureau drawers before time to start cooking supper. After several failed attempts at getting a confession from her sister, Amy told the neighbors that Hope must have the neatest bureau drawers in town. Of course, my mother and all the other busy women had to sit down and rest their feet once in a while, but they would pick up darning, patching, or knitting so they wouldn't be accused of just sitting around. Into the middle of this Maine work ethic came the new wife. When one of Orrin's cousins said to her in the post office, "I knocked on your door yesterday afternoon. You must have been away. Or were you out picking berries?" "Mercy, no," Miss Jessica said in her low, airy voice. "From 1 until 3, I'm sound asleep. Cotton balls in my ears, witch hazel packs on my eyes. I wouldn't hear you if you beat the door down. By noon 4, I'm bathed and dressed and presentable again." At 4 every day, I thought she was beautiful, even though some still talked about her less than pretty face. Her hair was crimped and fluffed out. She used a little powder and pink rouge on her cheeks. She wore soft, pale dresses of dotted Swiss or flowered dimity, and she smelled faintly of lavender toilet water. In her white shoes and pale stockings, she'd walk to the blacksmith shop with lemonade and cookies for Orrin, at a time when the tired, sweating village women were cooking supper. Miss Jessica said it didn't seem civilized to dine before 7. They weren't unkind to her face, but neighbors gathered in little groups outside the store or the post office or the church and shook their heads and clucked their tongues. I heard remarks like, "All foolishness to get a wife the way he did." He should have known. The secret napper, Hope's husband, Walter, said, "I wonder if all Southern women lay around all day, or if it's just her." Walter Williamson, Irma Coombs, Orrin's mother, said, "My daughter-in-law's house is kept in excellent order. She's a good cook and a good wife to Orrin. If taking a nap is her way, you just let it be." I was wishing she'd mentioned that Hope had been napping for years, but Irma was too virtuous to say a thing like that. As time went on, Miss Jessica had some tongue-clicking of her own to do, too. One day she sighed and said to my mother, "In all my years back home, I never heard a man break wind. Gentlemen simply didn't do that in the presence of ladies." She sighed again. "And up here, they don't even say, 'Beg your pardon.'" From my hiding place, I had to cover my mouth to keep from laughing at the thought of the Williamson men, for instance, begging anyone's pardon for an activity they viewed as a competitive sport. My greatest surprise in this north-south adjustment had to do with black people. We didn't see many, some chauffeurs and maids of summer people mostly, and I was proud when our young minister said that while Southern people mistreated blacks, we Northerners were more humane. Then, during the Depression, many white and some black men walked through the village asking for a day's work to pay for a meal, or searching for a hobo jungle near the railroad tracks. I noticed that many of the neighbors didn't answer when a black man knocked on their doors. "I'm scared of them," Myra Nash said. "Hard telling what they do." Then one day when I was playing by the brook behind Miss Jessica's house, I saw a young black man walking slowly by. Miss Jessica came out on the porch and called, "You, boy, come here to me." She handed him a towel and a pan and took him out to the pump where he could wash and cool off. Then she had him sit on the back steps and eat a plate of food. She gave him a clean old pair of orange socks to wear inside his torn shoes, and she didn't even ask him to do any work. After he left, I walked up to the porch. "You sure were nice to him, Miss Jessica," I said. "Poor colored," she said. "They shouldn't come up here. Northern people never treat them decent." I was confused after that. Eventually, the neighbors warmed up to Miss Jessica, and I think she grew to accept us too. We kids liked her before the adults did, though. Perhaps she was homesick sometimes, for she'd come down to the brook where we played, talk to us, and bring us little treats. One day when I was by the brook, I got a bad nosebleed. I was scared, and I ran to Miss Jessica's because it was closer than my own. My mother was always nervous about a nosebleed, but Miss Jessica treated it lightly. She gave me a big rag, sat me down with my head tipped back, and pressed a cold spoon to a spot on my neck. "It'll stop in a jiffy," she said. I was never scared of a bloody nose after that. One day I had run to her house again and was sitting holding the spoon on my neck while she had gone to the other side of the big kitchen to finish doing her dishes. Orrin, who didn't see me, crept up behind his wife and pinched her bottom. She jumped and giggled, and as she turned to reach up and cuff him with her wet hand, he bent down and gave her a big kiss. She giggled again and pushed him away. "Mr. Orrin, not before a child." Then he saw me and grinned. I don't think I'd ever seen him smile before, and I had never seen any man in our village be so playful with his wife. All foolishness to get a wife that way? I wasn't so sure. The end.